In the sprawling courts of ancient China, hidden behind ornate walls and luxurious chambers, lived countless women whose stories were never meant to be told. These women, often forgotten by history, were caught in the web of a society that measured a woman's worth by her beauty, her ability to bear heirs, and her loyalty to the emperor or her master. One such woman was Lin, a concubine who entered the royal court at a young age, full of hopes, dreams, and an innocent understanding of the world that would soon be shattered. She was born into a modest family, far from the grandeur of the imperial palace, but as fate would have it, her beauty did not go unnoticed. At the tender age of 16, Lin was selected to join the emperor's harem, a place where power, envy, and manipulation thrived. Though her family had hopes for her future, they knew this was the highest honor a young woman could achieve in their society. Little did they know, the honor would come at a great personal cost to Lin. When Lin first entered the palace, she was dazzled by the grandeur around her, the marble floors, the silk tapestries, the scent of rare flowers drifting through the air. Everything seemed like a dream. She had been taught that a concubine's role was to serve the emperor, bear his children, and provide him with companionship. But she quickly learned that the palace was a place of harsh realities, where women were nothing more than pawns in a game of politics and power. The emperor, though powerful, was but one part of a complex and unforgiving court system. Lin, like many before her, had been chosen for her youth and beauty, but these qualities quickly became nothing more than her ticket into a world where her worth would be measured by her ability to please and remain in favor. The competition among the concubines was fierce. Each one hoped to be chosen to bear the emperor's heir, for only the mother of a son would secure a lasting position in the court. For Lin, life in the emperor's harem was a blur of social hierarchy and endless competition. She was not the emperor's first choice, nor would she ever be his last. Yet, the power of the position kept her bound in a world that was more a gilded cage than a palace. The concubines, once hopeful young women, quickly transformed into rivals for power, status, and the emperor's affection. Lin had been warned that only those who could survive the politics of the court would last, and she soon learned what survival meant in the harsh environment of the palace. Days were spent under the watchful eyes of the head eunuchs, who ensured that every movement was scrutinized, every glance calculated. Lin was no longer just a woman. She was a tool, a piece in the emperor's elaborate game. Her beauty and grace had caught his attention initially, but the emperor's affection was fleeting. He would move from one concubine to another, each woman vying for his favor with gifts, beauty, and subtle manipulation. Lin's days were marked by a constant cycle of preparation for the emperor's nightly visits. She was expected to wear the finest silks, to present herself with the utmost poise and grace, but no amount of beauty could protect her from the underlying truth that awaited her every evening. The emperor's visits were not filled with romance or tenderness, they were political transactions. If Lin could bear him a son, she would rise in the ranks of the harem, but if she failed, she would be cast aside like so many others before her. In the beginning, Lin had tried to make herself indispensable, offering the emperor everything she could: loyalty, companionship, and even her body. But in the imperial court, such things were never enough. Lin had been chosen because of her appearance, her youth, and her family's connections, but beauty was fleeting in the world of concubines. The emperor would tire of her, as he did with all his concubines, and soon she would be forgotten in favor of younger, more beautiful women. But Lin's story was not just about the emperor, it was about the people who inhabited the palace alongside her. The other concubines, the servants, the eunuchs, and the officials, all played their part in the intricate web that was the imperial court. The eunuchs, though trusted servants, were often the most dangerous. They were the ones who knew the deepest secrets of the emperor and the women he kept, and they wielded their power over the concubines with a chilling authority. Lin soon found herself caught in the politics of the harem, where alliances were formed, betrayed, and broken with the shift of a glance. The women who surrounded her, once innocent girls like her, had transformed into calculating players in the court's ruthless game. Some sought to win the emperor's favor through seduction, while others used their cunning to manipulate the eunuchs and servants to gain an advantage. Lin, though kind-hearted and naive, could not help but learn from the women around her. In this world, survival meant becoming something she had never imagined. Her once bright spirit began to dim as she realized that, in the palace, kindness and innocence were luxuries that few could afford. As the days stretched into months, and the months into years, Lin began to understand that the only way to survive was to navigate the treacherous waters of the emperor's court with the same cunning and ruthlessness that the other women employed. Yet, despite her best efforts, Lin's place in the harem was never secure. There were always whispers that the emperor would choose another, that a younger woman would catch his eye, and Lin would be left with nothing but memories of the dreams she once had. Her story, like so many other concubines in the emperor's court, would be lost to time. Her name would never be remembered in the annals of history, and her legacy would be defined by the tragedies she endured behind closed palace doors. Yet, for Lin, the true tragedy was not the lack of power or favor, but the loss of her own identity. In a world where women were valued only for their ability to bear children and please the emperor, Lin had become nothing more than a shadow of the woman she once was. As Lin's days in the harem dragged on, her spirit began to break. She no longer dreamed of love or a life beyond the palace walls. Her every thought was consumed with survival, with the hope that she might one day gain the emperor's favor or, at the very least, ensure that her place in the harem was secure. But as time wore on, she realized that no matter what she did, no matter how much she tried to please the emperor, her fate was sealed. She was trapped in a world of ambition, manipulation and survival, and there was no escape. The tragic life of a concubine in ancient China was not just a tale of physical suffering, but of spiritual erosion. Lin, like so many others, had entered the palace with dreams of power, luxury and influence, but had been forced to trade those dreams for survival in a world where the price of living was the loss of everything that made her truly human. Lin's life in the imperial court continued to spiral into a world where every day seemed to blur into the next. The once grand dreams she had held now felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The hope of love, of a family, of a life filled with freedom, seemed impossible. The emperor's court, with its opulence and decadence, was a world that devoured the spirit, leaving only traces of the person she once was. As time passed, Lin's youth faded, her beauty no longer a source of power, and the fear of being forgotten loomed over her like a dark cloud. The palace was not just a physical structure, but a realm of complex emotions. Behind its towering walls, where the echoes of whispers were never far from the air, the concubines endured a constant battle. They were not only competing for the emperor's affection, but also for their own survival. As one of the lower-ranking concubines, Lin was often forced to witness the constant turnover in the emperor's affections. A glance, a smile, a shared moment in the emperor's presence. These were the precious things that determined the value of a concubine. Yet, no matter how she tried, Lin found herself always at the periphery of the emperor's attention. As the years wore on, Lin's position in the court became more precarious. The once vibrant palace, filled with laughter and life, had turned cold. The other concubines had become more hardened, more calculating. Some, who once were kind and hopeful, had now adopted the cruel ways of the court, knowing that to be gentle was to be weak. They had learned to manipulate not only the emperor, but also each other, creating alliances, forming rivalries, and playing dangerous games. Lin, however, remained largely isolated, struggling to understand the intricate web of power that had consumed the palace. But even within the walls of the palace, Lin had friends, albeit fleeting ones. The eunuchs, often silent and unnoticed, were more than just servants. They were the gatekeepers of the emperor's desires, and their power often rivaled that of the concubines. At first, Lin had regarded the eunuchs with suspicion and disdain, but she soon learned that they, too, were prisoners of the system. They had no choice but to serve the emperor, bound by the same societal constraints that held the concubines in place. Over time, Lin found an unlikely companion in one of the older eunuchs, a man named Wei, who had seen many concubines come and go. Wei, though silent on most matters, had a depth of understanding that Lin came to rely on. He knew the hidden truths of the palace, the secrets that were never spoken aloud, but passed through the halls with the same certainty as the changing seasons. It was through Wei that Lin learned more about the palace's inner workings and the unspoken rules that governed it. He taught her to watch the emperor's every movement, to observe the subtle shifts in the concubines' attitudes, and above all to never show weakness. Lin listened, absorbing the lessons in silence, knowing that if she was to survive, she needed to play the game as the others did. Wei's advice was simple but harsh. Survive, and if you can, rise. He explained that a concubine's worth was never truly defined by her beauty, or even her ability to bear a child. All what mattered was power, how much influence one could gain, how many allies one could make, and how much control one could hold over the palace's affairs. The emperor, he told her, was but a puppet of the court, swayed by the whispers of his closest confidants, and the women who knew how to make themselves indispensable. Lin had no choice but to follow Wei's advice. She began to navigate the palace with more caution, more calculation. She paid closer attention to the movements of the other concubines, noting who spoke to whom, who was favored by the emperor, and who was struggling to hold on to any semblance of power. Lin learned to keep her emotions in check, to smile when she needed to remain silent when silence was the only choice. She understood now that to show vulnerability in the palace was to invite betrayal. The walls of the harem were thick with secrets, but Lin had come to realize that the greatest secret was not hidden in the emperor's chambers or in the royal vaults, it was hidden in plain sight, within the hearts of those who served him. As Lin grew older, the pressure of the court seemed to weigh heavier on her shoulders. The other women, once her peers, had all moved on to greater roles, either becoming the emperor's favored concubines or bearing his heirs. Lin, however, had failed to achieve either. She remained just one among many, her name often forgotten in the sea of other women vying for the emperor's attention. Yet, despite her status, she could not help but notice the glances of the emperor when he passed by. Sometimes, just sometimes, his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than the others. It was as if he saw something in her, something different, something real. But those moments were rare, fleeting, and as the years passed, Lin began to realize that the emperor, like all the others, was not a savior, but another player in the game. Her fate was not tied to his favor, but to the shifting tides of the palace. If she wanted anything, it would not come from him. It would come from herself. Lin had been taught from the very beginning that to survive meant to adapt, to bend with the winds of change, to remain useful, but not to become indispensable. Despite her attempts to remain unnoticed, Lin soon became aware of something darker taking shape within the walls of the palace. A silent tension, growing steadily, was creeping through the air like the thick mist that blanketed the gardens at night. A new concubine had arrived, a beautiful young woman from the southern provinces, with wide, innocent eyes and a voice as soft as silk. She was everything Lin had once been, hopeful, full of life, and completely unaware of the dangers that lay ahead. Lin could see it in the way the emperor looked at her, in the way the other concubines watched her with envious eyes. They had seen this before. The arrival of a new favorite always signaled a shift in the balance of power. Lin couldn't help but wonder, would she become like the others before her, cast aside, forgotten and replaced, or could she survive the growing storm that threatened to consume the palace? For the first time in years, Lin felt a flicker of hope, a fleeting, fragile hope, that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to change her fate. But in the palace, hope was a dangerous thing. It was a luxury few could afford. The arrival of the young concubine, a delicate beauty from the southern provinces, sent ripples through the palace that Lin could not ignore. She had been in the harem long enough to recognize the signs, the way the emperor's gaze lingered on the new woman, the way the other concubines had begun to cluster around her, offering false smiles and sweet words that barely masked their jealousy. Lin could feel the shift in the air, an invisible tension that had settled over the harem like a heavy fog. It wasn't just the emperor who was drawn to the new concubine. It was everyone. The eunuchs who once ignored Lin's presence, now exchanged knowing looks and whispers as they hurried through the corridors. The servants, who rarely spoke to the concubines except in passing, now treated the newcomer with a level of deference that Lin had never experienced. She too had once been the object of such attention, but it felt like a lifetime ago. For the first time in years, Lin was no longer the center of the emperor's attention. Her nights, once filled with anticipation, now felt empty. She no longer had the hope of being chosen, of being seen as the one who could bear the emperor's heir. In the emperor's harem, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to give him a son, and Lin had failed in that regard. She had been unable to provide the heir the emperor so desperately sought, and now she was nothing more than a forgotten shadow in the court's relentless pursuit of power. Lin's position had become increasingly unstable. She had once thought that beauty and charm would be enough to ensure her survival, but the palace had taught her otherwise. It wasn't enough to simply please the emperor. One had to manipulate, strategize, and play the game of court politics. And in that game, Lin had always been one step behind. But this time, it was different. Lin had seen how the arrival of the new concubine shifted the balance of power. She could feel the growing rivalry, the subtle hints of betrayal, as the other women in the harem began to turn on each other in their desperate scramble to win the emperor's favor. Lin, though once a part of that world, now found herself on the outside, observing the chaos unfolding around her. The jealousy, the backstabbing, the whispered plots. She saw it all, but she no longer felt the need to partake. Instead, Lin withdrew into herself. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the most powerful weapon in the court's ever-shifting game. The emperor had stopped looking at her, and so she stopped looking at him. The other concubines began to treat her with indifference, seeing her as little more than a relic of a time when the emperor's affections were more easily won. Lin had come to terms with her place in the court. She was a survivor, and survival required adaptation. But as the months passed, Lin's indifference turned to bitterness. She saw how the young concubine, fresh and innocent, was being slowly corrupted by the same court that had twisted her own soul. The new concubine, though initially full of hope and excitement, began to show signs of the same weariness that Lin had once known. She was beginning to understand the price of beauty, the price of power, and the price of being the emperor's favorite. Lin couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction in watching the new woman's naive optimism start to fade. She had once been there, had once believed that if she could win the emperor's favor, she could find happiness. But happiness in the emperor's court was a fleeting illusion, and Lin had learned that the only thing that mattered was surviving the endless game of power. As the years wore on, Lin became a shadow in the court. She no longer attracted the emperor's attention, nor did she seek it. The court, with its constant shifts in favor, had become a place of hollow dreams for her. She no longer believed in the possibility of love or happiness. She was a piece in a game that had no end, and she had learned to accept it. The emperor had moved on, as had the other concubines, and Lin had become irrelevant. But even in her invisibility, Lin began to see the cracks forming within the harem. The emperor's infatuation with the new concubine began to wane, as it always did. He moved on to another young beauty, another face to replace the last. The cycle was unending, and Lin, once a part of it, had become an observer. She watched as the young concubines fought for power, betrayed one another, and slowly lost their souls in the process. She watched as the emperor's interest shifted from one woman to the next, each one thinking that she was the one who would bring him the heir, the one who would hold his affection forever. Lin knew better. She knew that no one could ever truly win in the emperor's court. There were no rewards, only endless cycles of hope and disappointment. The concubines who rose to the top were often the ones who sacrificed the most, whether it was their dignity, their loyalty, or their very sense of self. The emperor never truly saw them as people. To him they were simply tools, tools to be used and discarded as he saw fit. One day, Lin found herself walking through the palace gardens, alone. The weight of years spent in the court hung heavily on her shoulders, and she felt the familiar pang of loneliness that had accompanied her for so long. She gazed out at the beautiful landscape, lush trees, vibrant flowers, and the distant mountains that seemed so far away from the confines of the palace walls. The garden, once a place of serenity and escape, now felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. Lin wondered, for the first time, if there was a life beyond the walls of the palace. She had spent so many years serving the emperor, so many years navigating the treacherous waters of the harem, that she had never once stopped to consider what might lie outside. But now, as she stood alone in the garden, the thought of a different life, one where she could be free from the court's oppressive grip, seemed like a distant, impossible dream. Yet, deep inside, Lin knew the truth. There was no escaping the palace. There was no escaping the game. In the emperor's court, every woman was a player, whether she wanted to be or not, and for Lin, survival had become the only victory she could hope for. But as the years dragged on and the court shifted once again, Lin found herself growing weary of the endless cycle. The once vibrant hope she had held on to was slowly dying, replaced by resignation. She would never bear the emperor's heir. She would never rise to a place of true power, and so she lived on, a silent observer of a world she could never change. Lin's existence in the palace had become an endless cycle of days filled with quiet desperation and nights filled with the hollow ache of longing. As the years passed, she had grown numb to the intrigue and manipulation that pulsed through the very heart of the emperor's court. The once vibrant concubines had withered, their beauty fading, their power slipping away, as the emperor's attention shifted from one woman to the next. Lin had learned that in the end, no matter how much a woman tried to please, she would always be discarded when the emperor's favor moved on. But even as she had accepted the fate of the concubines, Lin couldn't help but feel the weight of the palace walls closing in around her. The years had not been kind, and with each passing day, her youth and beauty had faded. There were no children to remember her by, no heirs to carry on her name. She had become nothing more than a ghost, a shadow in the palace, and the other women treated her as such. She was no longer a player in the game of the harem, just a forgotten relic of a time when the emperor had once looked at her with interest. And then, one day, the emperor died. The news spread like wildfire through the palace. The once thriving court fell silent as the eunuchs rushed to the concubines' chambers to inform them of the emperor's death. For Lin, the news brought a mixture of relief and dread. The relief was obvious. The emperor's death meant the end of the endless struggle for his affection. the end of the uncertainty that had haunted her every move. But the dread was deeper, more unsettling. The death of the emperor meant the beginning of something new, a new emperor, a new court, and a new set of rules. The game would start all over again, but Lin knew that she would no longer be a part of it. The new emperor, young and inexperienced, was not as powerful as his predecessor had been. His court was filled with ambitious men and women, each one vying for power, seeking to control the fate of the empire. The concubines, once valuable only for their beauty and ability to bear heirs, now found themselves facing a new reality. With the emperor's death, the power dynamics within the palace shifted, and many concubines were abandoned as the new emperor sought to consolidate his rule. Lin was no exception. Her days of relevance had long passed. The new emperor, though kind, had no need for a concubine like Lin. She was no longer young, no longer beautiful, and no longer capable of bearing children. She had outlived her usefulness, and like the others, she was cast aside. The new emperor's court was a place of cold indifference. The once thriving harem was now reduced to a handful of women, many of whom were still young and hopeful, eager to secure their place in the new emperor's favor. Lin, now older and forgotten, found herself relegated to the shadows. The palace, once a place of power and intrigue, had become a place of isolation. The corridors that had once been filled with the laughter of concubines now echoed with silence, broken only by the footsteps of servants and guards. As the years wore on, Lin found herself growing increasingly distant from the world around her. The palace, once a place of endless ambition and power struggles, had lost its allure. The emperor's death had marked the end of an era, and Lin knew that she was no longer a part of the world she had once inhabited. She had survived, yes, but survival had come at the cost of everything that once made her who she was. Her beauty had faded, her youth had passed, and the power she had once wielded had slipped through her fingers like sand. She had become a mere shadow, a memory of a time long gone. The other women in the harem, the new concubines, had no use for her. They saw her as an old relic, a symbol of what had been, but no longer mattered. Lin had become a ghost in the palace, forgotten by the world she had once been a part of. One day, Lin found herself standing in front of a mirror, in one of the palace's many chambers. She looked at her reflection, and for the first time in years, she saw the truth. She had aged, her beauty had faded, and the dreams she had once held so dearly were now nothing more than distant memories. She had spent so many years chasing a life that was never meant to be hers, chasing the favor of a man who would never truly see her. In the end, she realized, the only thing she had ever truly been chasing was the hope that she could escape the endless cycle of power and manipulation that had defined her life. Lin, once a young woman full of hope and ambition, had become a woman trapped in the palace, a woman who had given up everything for survival. She had lost her identity in the process, her soul hollowed out by the demands of a world that had never truly cared for her. In the final years of her life, Lin found herself alone. The palace that had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and whispers of secrets was now quiet. The other concubines, once rivals and allies, had all moved on, leaving Lin behind. She wandered the halls, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The palace was no longer a place of power or luxury. It had become a prison, a tomb for all the women who had once lived within its walls. Lin's story, like that of so many other concubines, would never be remembered. She was a woman whose name would be lost to history, a woman who had spent her life serving a man who never truly saw her. She had been one of many, a woman whose worth had been defined by her beauty and her ability to please, but in the end, she had nothing to show for it but the remnants of a life spent in the shadows. And so, Lin's life came to an end, not with a grand ceremony or a final act of defiance, but in the quiet solitude of a forgotten concubine. Her story was one of tragedy, a tale of survival at the cost of everything that made her human. But in the end, her greatest tragedy was that she had never truly lived. She had been a pawn in a game she could never win, a woman whose existence had been shaped by the desires of others, never her own. As the years passed and the emperor's court continued to change, Lin's memory faded into the annals of history, her name never to be remembered, her life never to be truly understood. She was just one of many, a fleeting shadow in the palace of forgotten concubines.